For now, I want to share a little bit of a message with you again. I guess that's part of my gig. It is Bereshit. We have a new cycle of Torah readings. Bereshit is the Hebrew. We call it in English the book of Genesis, of course. And it says right in the very, very beginning of the text, when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light." And we have this incredible message of a light that shines before any sun and any moon or any star. It says that God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness God called night. There was evening, there was morning. Our very first day of creation. Everything I feel about life and our place here in this world is from these few lines. It's really true. Because it says when God began to create, so of course God is already around. God isn't created. It's not an in the beginning moment. It's when God got around to it moment. And when God began to create, there was this other stuff that God already brought into place, but it wasn't formed. It was unformed and void. And in Hebrew, the words are tohu vavohu, and our greatest of scholars don't really know what those words mean in this context. It's really unclear. We often will say unformed and void. Some will translate it as chaotic, chaos and void. Some will say it's a desert waste. I think that might be missing it. Chaim Potok said that the intent is very clear. Order that results from divine intent. Say that again, think about it. Order that's a result from divine intent. God started to make some order out of the chaos and out of the voids. That's the heart for me, of my theology. I want to share another reflection. It's from a rabbi. I've quoted him many times before. I think he was an incredible person in North American Jewry. His name is Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath. Rabbi Eisendrath is the former head of the Reformed Jewish movement in North America. Before he took the role of president of the Union of what was then called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, he was the rabbi of a very prominent synagogue in Toronto called Holy Blossom Temple. During World War II, he gave a Rosh Hashanah sermon where he let go of his previous pacifism, and he was concerned about how Canadians, not dissimilar from Americans, felt like the war was very distant, felt that the World War II and the Holocaust was so distant, they didn't always show concern about what was happening overseas, abroad, in Europe, in Nazi Europe. Eisendrath wanted to confront what his congregation was feeling as normal life. And in his sermon, he says something very profound. And I addressed some of the male-oriented language, but I think it'll still be the integrity of the message. He wrote, let us remember that when at the beginning of the whole universe was tohu vavohu, void and dark. It was the Spirit of God alone that brought order out of confusion, cosmos out of chaos, light out of blackout. It is God alone that can perform the creative miracle once more today. But then he says, let us cease then our trembling supplication, asking for all of those favors, right? Let us cease then our trembling supplication that God hasten to our aid, but seek instead to make certain that we are God's light bearers, not unto the privileged few, but unto the children, all the children of humanity. We are God's light bearers. There was chaos and unformed physical matter There was voids, which of course is a contradiction, chaos and void. But in this moment of creating, right before there's light, we have a model for us. God brings order and then light. Well, that's the hint of what we should be doing. Later in the sermon, he's referring to ideas of God's presence in our lives, how despite the hardships going on in the world, God will not abandon us. And I think the message is true for us now, right now. He says, such is the will of God. But to be realized on earth, it must become enshrined in the hearts and souls of men and women. Such is the lesson we Jews have learned in the annals of our past. Shall we, after so many centuries of heroic struggle and dauntless courage, fail to carry out that will of God in order, that out of the darkness there shall come light once more? Triumph, he says, shall indeed supplant our present tragedy if we do but become God's co-workers, if with sufficient zeal and sacrifice we carry out God's way on earth. What's the lesson? I know that the language is from the 40s and far more formal than anything I ever say to you. But what's the lesson? God creates order out of the void and chaos to create something amazing and imperfect. We have a teaching of acting godly, imitating God. So if God creates order out of chaos and void, well, that's a part of what we should be doing here. We make order too. That doesn't mean we fix everything and it's not going to be perfect. But we try and we strive and we work and we focus and we don't disappear because we're co-workers. Like Eisendrath said, partners, if you will. Now, we have just been through our holiest of holy days, and starting again with Bereshit, we're reading Torah anew this year. We have new experiences of our own this year. We hopefully have a new vision to move into this year with. So how do we move forward? If we don't move forward, then what were the high holy days for? Why bother? In Genesis, we see new struggles of human interaction. Adam and Eve were wrestling with the idea of their responsibilities in the world. They were created. They didn't ask to be created. There is no rule book yet. They don't have a Torah yet. And right away, there's conflict. Each of them tries to relinquish their responsibilities they have in the world. Yes, I know it's not totally fair. God didn't tell them all of the rules, and they already start with some tsuris and struggle and argumentation and blaming one another. I get it. Adam blames Eve for his own actions. Eve blames the snake. The snake has nowhere to go. Don't forget my favorite bumper sticker. Eve was framed. Very important. But with all of that said, if we're going to try and bring order, if we want to be co-workers or co-partners in continuing the work of creation, then we can't hide. We have to accept the responsibilities we have in this world. So I'm going to leave you with this little thought from Rabbi Sidney Greenberg, who is just an incredible preacher and poet. Years ago, he wrote a sermon. As you can tell, I like reading other people's sermons. He wrote a sermon and he shared this. We are not only shaped by our environment, we shape it. We are not only the creatures of circumstance, we are also the creators of circumstance. Our genes may determine whether our eyes are brown or blue, but whether we look upon each other with cold indifference or warm compassion is up for us to choose. Our physical height might be biologically determined, but our human stature, we fashion ourselves. Our environment determines the language we speak and the pronunciation we use. But whether our words are cruel or gentle, harsh or comforting, depends entirely on us. Our passions, appetites, and instincts are part of our animal equipment, but whether they rule us or we rule them is left for each of us to determine. It's Bereshit. And Bereshit in Genesis challenges us to consider how we're going to walk in the world, friends. Bereshit challenges us on how we're going to devote our time and energy and resources during this year. Bereshit challenges us not to pick up where we left off, but to begin again, intentionally, as God's partners, here to restore some order where others have experienced some chaos, emptiness, and darkness. And don't forget what I say each and every year in the Torah portion of Bereshit. And I know I'm only here 5 years or so, so maybe you don't always remember, but now you will. Rabbi Ed Feinstein, out in Los Angeles, he taught something so significant that I'll never forget it. I learned it 20 years ago. And it's one of the most simplest and yet most profound messages for this time of year, at least for me, so I'm going to share it again with you. He asked a question years ago, what's the holiest day of the year? And of course, Jewish tradition says it's Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the Sabbath of all of the Sabbaths, but for him, he says, no, it's not Yom Kippur. It's the day after. It's the day after. This is the day after. This is our Genesis. This is our Bereshit moment. I'm going to ask you, as we move into Aleinu, think about it for a second. Aleinu says that we're going to praise God, but also all of these things we've learned in our prayer service, it's on us. It's time for us. If you're inclined, if I encourage you to do so, share your reflection in the chat. How are we going to take a Bereshit moment today, this Shabbos, that you can carry into this new year? What is it that we can do to help bring some order, not cures, just order, an effort amongst the chaos and the void? So I'm not going to put it in the chat, but I'm going to say one so far. Vote. It's our responsibility and civic obligation. It is time to move forward and respond as you see fit. Vote. How else can you celebrate your new beginning this year? Your Bereshit. How are you going to bring some order amongst the chaos and void? Take 5-second break to think and reflect. And I invite you to put it in the chat. And then we'll turn to 586 at the